Hello, everybody, and welcome to this plenary session on trade unions and just transition. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is John Barry from Queen's University, Belfast. It's my pleasure to host and chair this afternoon or this morning session, this evening session, wherever you are. I mean, the reality is that often ecological issues, the planetary crisis, is associated with new social movements, such as the green and environmental movement. But what are the role of old social movements, such as the organised labour or trade union movement? The reality is that there are no jobs on a dead planet. And it is gratifying to see that the trade union movement globally, at different paces and in different contexts, are beginning to grapple with the issue of how we transition beyond a carbon-based ecocidal development model into a regenerative, low carbon and sustainable economy. And this is where the trade union movement and organised labour, I think, have a basis, a bridgehead for a discussion around a just transition. That as we move away from a carbon-based economy in particular to create climate resilient and regenerative economies, to ensure that nobody is left behind. And it is gratifying and interesting to see that, you know, in the Paris 2015 global climate agreement, that in the preamble, the just transition idea has been accepted. This was reaffirmed then in the Silesia Declaration in the Conference of the Parties that were held in Krakow. But there are still issues to be discussed in terms of the rapprochement between the ecological and labour. How are we going to ensure that displaced coal, oil and gas workers are fairly treated, to ensure that the green transition isn't about demonising those involved, for example, in the fossil fuel industry. And also then a particular reference to what some of our speakers will talk about today. What about socially useful production? To what extent can the skills and experiences of workers, even within the fossil fuel and other extractivist sectors, for example, can they be transitioned over into more sustainable, just and low carbon forms of production? So I'm delighted that we have 4 great guests and speakers to talk about these issues today. First up, we have Hilary Wainwright, who's just joined us, who's a fellow of the Transnational Institute and coordinates the European dimension of its New Politics project. She's a founder and editor of Red Pepper, a most excellent publication. Highly recommend you to subscribe, and is an active member of the World Transformed. And in particular, in relation to that idea of socially useful production, Hilary was between 1978 and 82. She worked with the Lucas Aerospace Shop Stewards Combine Committee and documenting their experiences in repurposing technology, practices, and workplaces towards socially useful production. She also, between 1982 and 86, she worked for the Greater London Council with Mike Cooley, who will also be mentioned by another speaker today, who was also involved in the Lucas Aerospace plan. She's a prolific author and commentator, and our latest book is A New Politics from the Left. So Hilary, you're very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Okay, so thanks, John, for such a full introduction, and apologies to the other speakers for not coming to the green room. I didn't get the email in time. And also apologies, I look as if I've had a fight. It wasn't over England last night, it was a cycle accident, but I'm actually fine. I just a bit worse than it looks, a bit better than it looks, rather. Anyway, so it's really exciting to be part of this discussion, and it's remarkable how I would say that the majority of Zooms that I've had, and I think it would be the same of Phil Asquith and other ex-shop stewards from Lucas Aerospace during lockdown, have been about the Lucas Aerospace plan. I mean, not about it on its own, but about the importance of that experience for the idea of a just transition. And so it's really, I think, I mean, I've got more and more inspired as I've carried on talking to people, being inspired by other people and by this interest, and also by the ways in which trade unionists, grassroots workplace trade unionists, have been taking up this idea of socially useful production in response to the challenges of the pandemic. I mean, for example, at the beginning of lockdown, when I was feeling, probably like all of you, a need to do something socially useful, I contacted through Unite shop stewards in Airbus as one of the companies that was responding to Boris Johnson's rather sort of general call, we need ventilators, not saying that we've completely failed to prepare the NHS for this crisis, but simply calling on his mates in the private sector to deliver emergency ventilators. And so I was sort of thinking, well, I wonder what the trade unionists in these companies are doing and thinking. And, because Johnson and the government, the last thing they were going to do was consult the workers. And so I talked to this Airbus convener in Broughton in North Wales. And it was amazing, because what had happened is that, when the emergency of the ventilator situation in the first phase of the pandemic was clear, the workers there said, yes, we could convert our factory making plane components into one making aircraft, ventilator components. We know how to do it. We've got that knowledge, we've got the know-how, and we've got an organization that could swiftly do this conversion. And that's exactly what they did. I mean, management was sort of saying okay, unlike in Lucas Aerospace, because they'd got the okay from the government. But the initiative, it was never really reported, and I tried to get it into the Guardian, and normally often I can, and they wrote back saying, well, there's too much detail about trade unions. Just kind of imagine that, too much detail about trade unions. But in a way, the whole point was that it was the knowledge and the capacity of the trade unions, the workers, organized through their local union, the workplace union, that made it possible for this conversion to take place. Anyway, that's just a sort of introduction to give you an idea of its relevance now. And other workers now, like in Rolls-Royce, that are facing job losses, not just because of the fall in markets for aerospace, but actually because management, as in a lot of companies, has had a plan for rationalization and is making use of the pandemic to implement it. But they too are now beginning to think about alternatives, a transition to a low carbon economy based on saving jobs and providing, in a way, fulfilling and skilled jobs. So why my question in a way for this discussion, and I suppose the wider debate about a just transition, is what was it about the Lucas Aerospace initiative that makes it so relevant today? What's the seeds of its longevity that we want to plant and spread? Because I think none of the last thing the existing shop stewards would want, I mean, they're ex-shop stewards, but they're still around and kind of become increasingly active in response to demand. And the last thing that Mike Cooley would have wanted, and he sadly died last year, but he was active and involved to the very last. And the last thing he would have wanted is the idea of a sort of imitation of the Lucas plan. So it's about what are the kind of key principles. And I would just suggest a few, maybe Brenda and others can elaborate. But I would say, firstly, the existence of a grassroots trade union organization that was democratic and accountable and transparent, so the members really trusted it. And it's been built up over years. I mean, I got involved in writing this book, which was sort of commissioned by the Combine and was really done with the Combine. I mean, I based it on all my interviews with them across the country. So it's oh, Brenda, hi. I mean, it's very detailed. I hope you wouldn't find it boring, but I think it sort of makes the roots of the Combine and of the plan very, very vivid and very real. So this Combine had been growing. I was only involved from '78, but it had been growing from the late '60s, I think. Yeah, certainly early '70s, in response to having a management that was playing off the different sites, the different factories. And so they decided to come together. The existing trade union movement, the structures weren't adequate. So they created, like many shop stewards in engineering, their own, what they called combine committee, because it combined unions, different unions at the workplace, the office unions, the designers unions, and the shop floor, most of which are now actually in Unite. So there's a kind of easier organizational day. That was the one key thing, that there was an organization that already had the trust of the members and brought people together brought workers together across the sites, and had developed a sort of ethos of democracy, listening to each other, valuing the capacities of the members, and also kind of a belief in the capacities of workers, in the skills they had, and in the importance of those skills. So that leads me on to the second point, which is this belief, a unionism and a politics, if you like, because it was in a way political in a broad sense. It didn't really accept that division that's plagued the labour movement in Britain between politics and trade unionism, that's expressed in the nature of the Labour Party and its relation to the unions, by which, you know, anything political is handed over to the Labour Party in exchange for the Labour Party saying that it won't interfere with the unions. Of course, in government it has, as we know, with sustaining anti-trade union legislation and so on. So the other thing was this belief in the capacity of workers and its members. So its members weren't seen as simply paying their dues. They were seen as skilled producers with real capacity, creative capacity. So when, I mean, I'm assuming people know roughly the history of the plan, but very briefly, you know, the many of the factories were facing closure as a result of basically corporate rationalization, not a real, you know, lack of markets or anything. And they were being told that they were redundant. These workers, these skilled workers, designers, engineers, and so on, were, I mean, everybody was skilled in their own way, and they were being told they were redundant. And they, you know, they were kind of angry with this because they felt they weren't redundant. They could see all around them the things that needed to be done to do with transport, the environment, health. I mean, they were already making kidney machines. Well, how could workers making kidney machines be called redundant when there was still a growing need for kidney machines and for other medical equipment? So they immediately resisted in the traditional ways to industrial action. And then they were in contact with Tony Benn, who I think had just become Minister for Industry, and was talking to them about, do they want him to nationalise the aerospace components industry, which they were part of. And so they had a long combine committee meeting about it. Luckily, it was taped, so I could listen to it, where they said, well, I mean, some of them came from areas where there'd been nationalisation, but that had led to job loss. So they were saying, well, nationalisation on which, if not on our terms, isn't the answer. And the end result of all this discussion was, we need a plan to set out our terms for nationalisation, and then we can go back to Tony Benn and get support. So then they started to think, how do they do that plan? And initially, you know, they thought, well, we better go to some experts. So they wrote to think about 180 academics, and only 4, one of whom wrote the book with me, Dave Elliott, only 4 responded with any ideas and any enthusiasm. So the combine committee thought, well, actually that was a mistake. You know, we should have looked to our own members. So that's exactly what they did. They then went to their own members with a survey, which was both to identify the capacity of the members and the factories, the machinery they had, the capacity they had, and then to look at what other products could be made with this capacity. And so there was a very interesting, in a way, the survey, the questions as often happens with questions. Sorry, I got a slightly dry throat. But kind of got people thinking. So I remember in the book, it quotes Mick Cooney, one of the conveners in Burnley, one of the northern sites, who said, we suddenly had to think like planners. You know, we've not thought like that before. So there was a kind of change in thinking towards actually, you know, we could be planning. We know as much as management. I mean, I think Mike Cooley used to say, you know, that management was really just a hangover from the church and from the military, and that actually, you know, it was a sort of redundant role in its traditional forms. So there was immense confidence. I mean, this was also a period after decades or so of very, very strong bargaining strength in the engineering industry during the boom and so on. So these workers were not highly organized, highly confident, and highly, sounds like there's a building site in the background, but not my background, somebody's background. Maybe they could go on to mute. But anyway, so they went to their members, and out of their members' discussions and thinking came about 150 products that they could be working on. Products, I mean, which are detailed in this book, but they range from energy conservation products, very ingenious transport products that involved rail, being able to convert a road vehicle to a train or bus, really effectively, into being able to use tracks. So this was particularly useful in difficult terrain, particularly in parts of the developing world. They developed ideas about medical equipment, often based on discussions with the community about kids suffering from spina bifida, and other examples like this. So I can tell you more in the discussion. But I think it's that idea of believing in your members, building a trade unionism which is based on a sense of workers as producers with immense capacity and immense creativity. And secondly, this idea of thinking about their work as socially useful and wanting to, given the failure of the market in a way, to meet social need, then we need another way. And already, you know, obviously we know government is massively involved in industry, so that Lucas really, as a company, depended on defence contracts. So it was already beyond the market in a traditional sense. It was a government, it was in a government market. So why couldn't that market, anyway, be shifted from defence to medical or to environmental purposes? So there was a very clear sort of economic argument, and they made contact with people in the health service and sort of tried to develop a notion of planning from below, in a way, which we tried to develop at the GLC with the popular planning unit that I and others set up in the Industry and Employment Department of the GLC. Mike worked in the Greater London Enterprise Board, which developed another dimension of the Lucas Plans principles, which is this idea of recognizing there's huge capacity locked in academia, and it too needs to be released for socially useful purposes. And so just as the Combine Committee eventually had experience of working with academics in different universities to create prototypes of the alternative plan, because what they believed was that rather than simply write about the plan, they should build on people's skills, which are expressed, what might call, they were tacit skills, tacit knowledge, which is things that we can do but often can't codify or document. So that, in a way, was the skill of the designer and the skilled engineer. So the plan put emphasis on prototypes, which became a kind of agitprop by practice, so that they took around a prototype of the road rail vehicle, and I think also the spina bifida cart. But this was their philosophy. And then in London, when we worked at Mike worked at the Greater London Enterprise Board, and I worked in popular planning, and there's quite a big department. We worked with the huge number of institutions, academic institutions in London, to create what we called technology networks, by which different departments of these academic institutions would be deployed and allied with the GLC to provide support for this idea of socially useful production. So there are many examples of, I remember the most vivid one, because I made use of it, was the electric bike that could be very easily, used in unmountainous countryside and so on. But there are many other examples. I probably better end there, but these are some of the ideas that we can carry on from the Lucas experience without being constrained by that model, and facing huge new challenges of a much weakened trade union movement, the lack of support from the Labour Party, and up against a more, vicious corporate capitalism, accompanied by increasingly right-wing governments. So it's not a happy picture in terms of what we face, but we do have immense resources in our history, and in not just the memories, but also the ways in which different generations have developed those ideas.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hilary. It's always better to light a candle than curse the dark, as it were. And I think you've certainly opened up some of the issues that we need to consider of innovation, particularly worker-based, democratized innovation, and not just innovation in technology, although you've given some examples there, but what about social innovation and new ways of living, and so on. So I think we'll continue this discussion perhaps, and you'd mentioned one person there, Professor Mike Cooley, who our next speaker will also touch upon, and that is Brenda O'Neill, who works in the Department of Computing and Mathematics at the Waterford Institute of Technology, and she's currently undertaking a PhD. She's a member of the Insight Cooley Research Lab, which is essentially a human-centered ethos coming from the late Professor Mike Cooley that Hilary has already mentioned, in terms of using technology for human purposes. And again, Mike Cooley was also central in the Lucas Aerospace Plan, and who he did believe that technology should augment but not replace human labor, particularly the dignity of human labor. And again, something that Brenda might touch upon is something that Hilary has mentioned: the tacit knowledge of workers, of producers, should also be valued. So Brenda, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks so much, Hilary, as well. I'm delighted to hear you talk, and I'm delighted also to be invited to talk here today. So what I'll do is I have a few slides and I'll share them with you, so bear with me now. Okay. Just bear with me now for a moment. Okay, so can everyone see that?
Yes, we can, Brenda.
That's great. Okay. Okay. This is me, Brenda O'Neill, academic and PhD student, as John said. They're a member of the Insight Cooley Research Lab. And if anyone wants to contact me about anything, beo'neill@wit.ie. Okay. Professor Michael Cooley, as an introduction, I'm working in the Insight Cooley Research Lab as part of my PhD. It's a multidisciplinary lab established to digitize the late Professor Michael Cooley's collection, which was donated by his family to the Luke Wadding Library in WIT. And I'll just tell you a bit more about Professor Michael Cooley. Great Irish scientist, trade union innovator and activist, and pioneer of the concept we all call the just transition. This was a description given by President Higgins from The Legacy of Mike Cooley, The Future of Work and the Just Transition, in a few weeks ago there, to mark his Michael Cooley's first anniversary. So Michael Cooley was an Irishman from Tuam in County Galway. He was possessed with a deep sense of what a scientific culture meant for workers in factories artisans, and traditional communities. He was the first recipient of the Right Livelihood Award, which was an alternative to the Nobel Prize, and consistently placed human needs at the heart of automation projects. He was a founder of the human-centered systems movement, which led to anthropocentric systems in Germany and informed socio-technical thinkers in the UK, Ireland, and Scandinavia. And his work valorized human tacit knowledge and skill, arguing that machine intelligence should augment, not replace, human endeavor. So what are the values of, say, a human-centered system? Valorization of tacit knowledge, which Hilary mentioned there as well, which is that which we know but cannot tell. It was described by Michael Polanyi in 1967 in his book, The Tacit Dimension. And I suppose to give you a kind of an everyday example, it's like when you learn to ride a bicycle and then you have to tell someone else how to ride a bicycle. You know, there's things that you innately know that you find hard to describe, and that's what tacit knowledge is. Automation or AI should augment but not replace the work of the human in the system, and the worker and the machine form a human-machine symbiosis. So the machine or the automation or the AI is an aid to the worker. So in Waterford, we have the Professor Michael Cooley collection, and Dr. Larry Stapleton was a key figure in the acquisition of the Cooley collection for WIT. The family of Professor Cooley donated his personal library, correspondence, and materials to the Luke Wadding Library at Waterford Institute of Technology, and for this we are very grateful. And this manifested in the form of 34 boxes, including about 1,400 physical books, and the collection was formally open to scholars and students in March 2019. And the primary goal is curation with a view to digitising the collection and organising metadata while staying loyal to the values of human-centred systems, which Mike Cooley founded and promoted. And the lab is a living lab, and so far has been the basis of final year projects for undergraduate and postgraduates alike, and has also established a PhD programme. Now, the relevance of Professor Michael Cooley's ideas, and Hilary spoke there about the Lucas plan and the fact that the workers themselves came up with 150 different product ideas that were socially beneficial, and these were under 6 categories. And the categories were medical equipment, transport vehicles, improved braking systems, energy conservation, oceanics, and telecharic machines. And the idea was to come up with a bottom-up alternative for the Lucas Aerospace Company. And there were 17 plants in the UK, but the plan was particularly driven by the workers at the Burnley plant. And this is where the Combine Committee, one of the Combine Committees was established. And I suppose they're asking the question, what could be manufactured by the company using the workers' current skills and the current equipment that could be responsibly produced and socially beneficial? And that's how they came up with these ideas under these various headings. And at the heart of the Lucas plan is the idea of the just transition from armament production to responsibly produce socially beneficial product manufacturing. And here we have, and Hilary mentioned it there, the road rail bus. And you can see it looks like an ordinary bus, but it can actually go on a railway track, and then there's some kind of lever where you can drive it off the railway track and it goes up hills and all that. So this was just one of the ideas that they had. Also, in relation to Mike Cooley, it is from his seminal publication, Architecture B, published in 1980, that he coined the term human-centered systems. And Mike Cooley's pioneering introduction to socially useful production and human-centered manufacturing systems in this particular edition had a new foreword by the General Secretary of the TUC, herself an advocate of the lessons of the Lucas Plan for alternative production priorities. And it was stated that it was years ahead of its time, and it's essential reading for all those seeking a democratic alternative to the politics of austerity. Delinquent Genius then, Michael D. Higgins gave a foreword to that, and he said about it that there is something immensely hopeful in this sheer power that comes from retaining one's early curiosity, harvesting it through scholarship and delivering it for the benefit of mankind. And another book by Michael Cooley then was The Search for Alternatives. And Karamjit Gill, a professor emeritus in Brighton University, gave the introduction through that. And he says that through his historical insights into the evolution of digital technology, Mike Cooley provides a stimulating narrative for understanding the impacts and implications of the new digital technologies of machine intelligence and automation. Cooley's main concern is the misuse of technology, which can, amongst other things, create a frantic work tempo for some and a dull queue for others. And although humans with their skill and ingenuity were able to create technological change from the early stages to the advance of artificial intelligence, the society which has given birth to them tends to fail to keep pace. And beside that, we see there the cover of the academic journal AI and Society. And Michael Cooley was the founding chairman of this journal and had a close working relationship and friendship with Professor Karamjit Gill. Now, in relation to the plan, as you know, the plan was never accepted. And Michael Cooley states that this was for two reasons. One, the company didn't want to manufacture any socially beneficial but not profitable item. And number two, the challenge to the power structure. So coming from, say, a hierarchical top-down power structure, changing that, really literally turning it on its head and having a bottom-up power structure. So even though the plan was never implemented, it is significant in that it was the first bottom-up alternative plan created as an alternative to redundancy. The just transition it provided is still as relevant now as ever. It is still an alternative when a product line ends, or as in the world today, when climate catastrophe beckons. And after Lucas, Mike Cooley, along with Ken Livingstone, founded the Greater London Enterprise Board in 1982, which was an industrial development and job creation agency set up by the Greater London Council to create employment by investing in the industrial regeneration of London. And Hilary mentioned that as well in her talk there too. So just transition due to climate change, well, that is certainly required. And I suppose in Ireland we have Board Namona, and I think Paul will be speaking about this later on, so I won't say much about that. And just transition due to the COVID pandemic then. So from pandemic unemployment payment to unemployment or the dole or whatever alternatives are out there, a just transition is required here also. And the Nevin Economic Research Institute, Dr. Lisa Wilson, gave a good talk on this in the Legacy of Michael Cooley event that took place a few weeks ago as well. And a just transition that a company have tried to implement, which Lisa mentioned, was Nokia and the Bridge Programme. And Nokia decided to let their workforce know in advance, if they're going to be let go, and gave them 5 alternatives. So number 1, find another job at Nokia. Number 2, find another job outside Nokia that you have the skill sets for. Number 3, start a new business, and they give cash grants and training or reskilling. Number 4, learn something new or reskill. And number 5, create your own path, take the redundancy and create your own path. And this program has been set up by Nokia and its employees, and in that regard has parallels with the Lucas plan. And also there's the Institute for the Development of Employees Advancement Services, or IDEAS Institute, established by SIP2 in February 2001. And they have a similar kind of program called the Crossroads Training Program. And the objective of the program is to equip workers with the knowledge and techniques to allow them to evaluate and assess their skills and experience, and to assist them in identifying ways or paths by which they can develop a new career. The government, the employees, unions and workers all need to be involved for a just transition to work. And I suppose in a way, a just transition is another example of valorising human tacit knowledge. And so lessons from Michael Cooley for contemporary challenges and opportunities. Well, the first one, there is another way illustrated by the Lucas Plan, but it needs unions, government and employees on board. The second one, the climate crisis and the COVID pandemic brings into focus just transition from fossil fuels and back to employment, respectively. Human tacit knowledge should always be valorised. So the human should always be kept at the centre of the loop. Automation AI should augment the work, not replace the human, so the human-machine symbiosis. And the one best way is a myth. Future paths are not predetermined. And I leave the last work to Mike Cooley. He says here, we must not allow our common sense to be bludgeoned into silence by the determinism of science and technology, into believing that the future is already fixed. The future is not out there in the sense that America was out there before Columbus went to discover it. It has yet got to be built by human beings, and we do have real choices, but these choices will have to be fought for, and the issues are both technical and political. We have to decide whether we will fight for our right to be the architects of the future or allow a tiny minority to reduce us to be-like responses. And that's where I'll end my talk. I want to thank all of you for your attention and thank Hilary there as well. It was a very insightful talk. So thanks very much, folks.
That's lovely, Brenda. Thank you very much, and nicely complements what Hilary was talking about. And again, while for the audience where we are looking at the examples from Britain and particularly Ireland, of course, many of these issues in relation to worker-based, democratized, respecting the creativity and agency of workers, of course, are universal, and that's hopefully something we can pick up in the Q&A. So our next speaker is Paul Goldrick-Kelly, and he's an economist with the Nevin Economic Research Institute based in Dublin, Ireland. Paul's work has examined issues related to healthcare, housing, tax and revenue sufficiency, as well as productivity performance in the Republic of Ireland. Paul's current research interests relate to ecological sustainability and political economy, incorporating issues related to the just transition. And he's currently pursuing a PhD looking at carbon lock-in and its manifestation and propagation through institutions. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the event organisers, and thanks to the previous two speakers. Those are really interesting presentations. I suppose just what I thought I'd speak to kind of briefly is the case of Bord na Móna in the Irish context. So this could be really seen as Ireland's test case for the just transition. We're very late to the game, as many of us would be aware of, but if you aren't, Ireland is considered very much a kind of climate laggard. We have very high emissions per capita. Emissions have only recently kind of begun to fall, but I suppose that depends on how you measure it. So the Bord na Móna case, it's sort of a tester of our ability to transition here and its effects for the workers involved. So this came to a head now. We've agreed, it's been agreed for a long time, it's been fairly obvious that peat hasn't much of a future in terms of energy generation. Peat is among the dirtiest of fossil fuels. It's very inefficient. You have to expend and burn a lot of peat to generate any energy. So this was an obvious target, sort of low-hanging fruit here. So there had been plans in the works to retire peat use, and that involved peat harvesting and its use in peat-fired energy plants. But it came to a head, and I guess my involvement in this arose at 2018, 2019, when essentially the state-owned energy providing company, the ESB, they had their plans to convert a peat-fired plant struck down into a coal-fired plant, which would have entailed some peat use. Now that had kind of implications for the workers involved in the ESB, but actually the biggest effects were for workers in another semi-state, Bord na Móna, which was set up in the 1930s as a development vehicle for the area and to sort of exploit peat resources as a way of kind of ensuring energy security. So the plans were significantly brought forward. And really at that point, it became a scramble. The government and other parties hadn't really anticipated this kind of sudden planning change. So it caught everyone on the hop. So in terms of my involvement with ICTU, that's the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, so we looked at that situation, and some of our proposals were a Just Transition Commission to engage in social dialogue, so the workers, the unions and communities would be involved. So in the future, really, we'd actually have some planning in place, and it wouldn't simply, it'd be a proactive as opposed to a reactive approach to these things. And sort of key from, I suppose, my intervention in this is that unusually, I suppose, the ESB and Bord na Móna actually offer something of an advantage in the Irish case. We do have large publicly owned vehicles through which we can, achieve these kind of goals and these sorts of transitions, despite some changes in the ESB and Bord na Móna, which converted them into far more profit-centric organizations, really. And even some rulings and directives from the EU, which sort of forced the ESB to change and become more liberalised. But in any case, we propose that these significant assets could be used really to really lead these transition efforts with due attention paid to workers and communities. And we pointed out this is all the more pressing because the classic sort of just transition case, the Midlands is unusually poor in the context of Ireland's characterised by low incomes. You've high rates of unemployment, and you've high dependence on these sort of carbon intensive jobs, which are some of the better jobs in the area. And also even zooming out in terms of the economic context, if you compare investment rates in the area versus other places, it's very low. So we argued, all that considered, by all appearances, the idea that you could sort of just let the cards fall as they may and let market forces lead this, that would just exacerbate these economic difficulties and potentially just lead the area to spiral downward. And so I mentioned those that social dialogue, the Just Transition Commission. So we pointed to the potential for a lot of renewable energy in the area that haven't been exploited. So the semi-states could really take a lead in those areas. And we also proposed, like more broadly, it's very commonly kind of recognized in the Irish context that we have issues with the demand for carbon intensive energy because we have very old and energy inefficient buildings. And so we are proposing an extensive retrofit program led by the state, which could provide employment and actually just hit some other kind of desirables here. There's a lot of energy poverty in the state. People find it difficult to heat their homes, and energy costs are high, so you could lower energy costs. And we also said that the state should really step in to kind of intervene in the area to develop a kind of new pathway. Public transport in the area is poor, locking you in really to the use of the car if you want to get anywhere. The Irish state has been very reluctant to engage in things R&D to sort of develop new technologies, new opportunities. And actually, despite the fact that our education budgets appears large, if you look at it adjusted for how many young people we have, we're quite a young country in relation to other European countries, we really don't spend much on education. And that particularly given the austerity years, higher education really took a hit. And that has implications for the regional kind of centres, which could really build that capacity that we heard referred to, these regional ITs, to really kind of secure an alternative pathway. So what subsequently happened? So a Just Transition Commission was set up. There was, although I don't have the figures to hand, there was money allocated to the transition experience, although the degree to which this is new money, it looked like a lot of this was renamed or redirected from other sources. So that did happen. From my perspective, I guess not directly involved in the IR side, I did, like in terms of some of the reports and suggestions that were coming out for what happens afterwards, I was a little concerned to hear, talk of tourism. Of course, if we're kind of thinking through the climate and all its implications, that isn't a kind of cost-free plan from the climate side, as well as things like call centers, which isn't to denigrate any of the workers in those areas, but those aren't typically characterized by decent employment, and they can be pretty tough places to work in. So we have that. I guess more broadly, the Irish government has been criticised even by the likes of the European Commission, that when they've drawn up their power generation plans, which they're forced to, the Commission actually comments on our pieces saying, where are the discussions of the skills, the workers affected, the impacts of this? So that's considered underdeveloped. And I think that's going to be key, seeing as the government's committed to a reduction of emissions by about 51% by 2030. So the idea that they're making these budgets, but very little attention has been paid to this point about what happens for those areas is pretty concerning. We also have, increasingly, there's kind of talk, given COVID, the cost of this. We're going to have to tighten our belts. I read recently that the European People's Party, I think that's EPP, that of which Fine Gael, one of the kind of governing coalition, are a part, are insisting that we go back to a strict adherence to the fiscal rules, which is sort of, if we're considering the amount of investment that's going to be needed, is pretty concerning. And even just, I suppose, to venture off in another way that the kind of COVID context might provide food for thought. Some of my colleagues at NERI have actually been looking into the way that actually the new pandemic payments, your PUPs, etc., they're being kind of characterized as extremely generous and extremely costly, but actually those schemes and the employee schemes actually brought the likes of the UK and Ireland, which are typically among the most kind of miserly social welfare systems in terms of what you get after having lost your job at an average wage or under the average wage. They actually just brought them to where European countries are typically. And as my colleague has said, we've already ventured out the concept that, well, we might have to shut certain portions of our economy down for the collective good. That sounds familiar, and it sounds very pertinent really to the just transition case, and that could be essential to manage this. But as John has said, even in terms of the broader context in Ireland, there's a lot of space to really collect a lot more revenue, and for the state to become a lot more involved in this process. It seems, at least personally, that there's a danger of the just transition concept becoming motherhood and apple pie, in that it's sort of the degree to which people have agreed and consent to the concept has been directly related to that concept really just being voided of any definitive worker-related content. It just sounds, well, justice, who can complain about justice here? So I think a key point to emphasize and really consider moving forward is to really bring back that kind of content, and the sort of content that Brenda and Hilary referred to will be really crucial in transition efforts. So I suppose we can take from there. I'll conclude my comments there, and I thank everyone for their attention.
That's great. Thank you, Paul. And in particular, in terms of, we can learn as much from unjust transitions of the type that Paul has described, but also what Hilary and Brenda were talking about, actually, that the Lucas Aerospace, inspirational and pioneering as it was, it actually never really seen the light of day in terms of actually being put into practice and so on. So, there are useful lessons there to be learned from defeats and setbacks as there are from, actual wins and so on. So our last speaker today is a good friend and colleague, Sean Byers. Sean works for Trademark, which is part of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, a learning and educational element of the trade union movement here in Ireland. And he's authored a number of papers in terms of issues of the double transition from our context of from war to peace to neoliberalism in Northern Ireland, and particularly looking at the role of the trade union movement in a post-conflict situation. He is an active member of Unite Union and the Belfast Trades Council, and he co-hosts an excellent podcast. So just as I gave a plug for Red Pepper magazine, I give a shout out for an excellent podcast called A Worker's Guide to Everything. And John has developed a particular interest in recent years on the just transition and organised labour. So over to you, Sean.
Cheers, John. And thanks for the invitation to take part. There's been some really brilliant sessions part of this conference, and it's a real credit to the organisers. As John has said, like I can't claim to be an expert on the just transition, but I have an active interest in it as a trade union activist and as someone who's been involved in trade union education for a long time. I'm going to focus my initial comments on the Irish context and the Irish trade union movement at the risk of being parochial, but hopefully in a way that speaks to the subject in its broader sense. So as Paul has said, it's no secret that Ireland North and South is lagging behind when it comes to climate action. The just transition is poorly understood and applied. And as particularly if we're going to take the view of the just transition as an economy and a society-wide transformation. Within the Irish trade union movement, there have been some positive discussions and campaigns that address different aspects of the just transition broadly understood. John and his colleagues have done a lot of the spade work in tracking this progress. So a number of trade unions, a small number of trade unions are trying to lead the way in terms of spelling out what a worker-focused and community-focused just transition would mean in an Irish context. Brendan's mentioned SIP2, Force is another one, and of course ICTU has done its own work on that front. Trade unions North and South have been centrally involved in campaigns for public transport, water, housing, all issues that connect social reproduction to climate action and that constitute the building blocks of any just transition, really. More recently, we've seen the emergence of Right to Disconnect and 4-day week campaigns. And I think the latter is particularly important and exciting, given its potential to reduce our carbon footprint and the positive outcomes we've seen 4-day week achieved in Iceland, according to recent reports. Of course, workers have been taking inspiration from the Lucas Plan and exploring the possibilities for conversion to socially useful production, most notably during the 2019 occupation of the Harland Wolff shipyard. Now, the workers didn't get the outcome that they desired or that they were hoping for, but it just showed the potential, and it showed that workers in Ireland aren't immune from these conversations, and they're up for these sort of discussions. And ICTU both directly, the ICTU both directly and through its support for the work of Paul and his colleagues at NERI, have been engaging in the concept of a just transition, and just this year agreed at its Northern Ireland conference to launch a just transition campaign. Now, what form that takes, it remains to be seen, but it's good that we've seen that commitment come forward. But I think it's fair to say that we're not where we should be. I suspect that John invited me to take part in this to maybe deliver a bit of a provocation, so hopefully I won't disappoint on that front. If we're to take the view that the just transition requires a deeper social and economic transformation, then there are a number of areas where I think we're falling short. And I have a list, but I'll focus on just three. So firstly, when we consider the failure of the private sector to decarbonize, as Hilary has said, along with the concentration of economic power and wealth in society, it's clear that we need to put social ownership back at the heart of a trade union approach to climate action. So not only publicly owned utilities and energy, and as Paul has alluded to, like there's huge potential for that in the island of Ireland, but the expansion of democratic ownership and control across all aspects of the economy. So we're talking about municipal ownership, support for worker buyouts, for industrial reconversion, and for socially useful production. That support just doesn't exist in Ireland at all. A rebuild of Ireland's decimated cooperative sector, which was once very strong. In rural areas, community-supported agriculture, localized food systems, and the exploration of frameworks such as community wealth building that act as enablers for those types of models. And Paul himself has done some work on this. And all of this needs to be supported by the building of mechanisms for real democratic planning and decision making, not the hollow form of democracy that we have in Ireland. Now, lots of the research, the groundwork, the precedents for this kind of thing exist, but it's just not a central part of the trade union agenda in Ireland in the same way as it might be in Britain or other parts of Europe. Secondly, and connected with the question of ownership, are the crucial issues of power and class. Now, I accept that some degree of social dialogue is necessary, that we have to speak to people we don't like. We have to make uncomfortable alliances and compromises and so on. But the nature and the scale of the transformation required at this stage in Ireland and elsewhere implies that existing power structures and vested class interests will have to be challenged. Now, the Irish trade union movement does place a heavy emphasis on social dialogue, both in the context of climate action and more generally. And this isn't even not a new phenomenon. Corporatism has been the sort of guiding philosophy of Irish trade unionism, industrial relations practice for the best part of a century. And particularly in the South, and there are historical reasons for that, but it's also crept into trade union thinking and practice in the North. So the problem is not just that this sort of unbridled faith in social dialogue is now failing to have any real impact on the government's plans. All of the vested interests in Ireland remain untouched in the government's climate action plans. It's not having any impact on the logic of capital or capital flows, but it's been proven in Ireland to be a disaster for the trade union movement over the period of decades. So at a time of rising trade union membership during the pandemic, class consciousness, growing militancy amongst some sections of workers, and at a time when Ireland is undergoing rapid political realignments and when different forms of climate resistance are emerging within communities and so on, it's a concern to see people speak not only of strengthening social dialogue approaches, but going beyond that and into formal social partnership arrangements. And I think we really have to guard against that. Now, there's no easy answer to this, or a time machine, or a purge, or written branch reform of the movement. But the alternative really is, as Hilary has pointed out today and in the work that all of her writings, is that it's a hard slog of building a democratic grassroots movement that harnesses the knowledge and creativity of workers and forges alliances with the social and political forces that are gravitating to the left. Thirdly, and finally, any just transition worthy of the name has to be rooted in principles of internationalism and anti-imperialism. And I think historically, Irish trade unions have been quite good on these questions, owing in part to our own colonial experience. But it seems to me that we're still very focused on what a just transition means in the context of the global North. So amongst other things, we need to more properly consider the implications of our transition and our potentially job-rich transition to renewables, the implications for frontline workers and communities in the global South. And that's in terms of resource demands, in terms of the exploitative and conditions of extraction and production, and the conflict and the murder that's entailed by the scramble for raw materials. And I think we're good on these questions in rhetoric, and we're good in terms of engaging through networks, but we would need to take it out of the internationalism and anti-imperialism, out of committee rooms and out of the sphere of lobbying and reform. I think international labour standards and human rights frameworks are important, but more important is that they move from paper to reality. And that requires organising, it requires disruption, it requires solidarity, right across the supply chain. And there's people who've done really good work on this. Thea Francos, who's an author of or co-author of a really good book on the Green New Deal, but she's done really good work on how you do this or what this entails, solidarity across supply chains and across global capitalism. And I know Unite has started to do some work on this. And really the big unions, the big general unions are uniquely positioned to lead the charge on this front. But increasingly, as we start to move towards a low carbon society, greater sections of our movements are going to have to get on board with this sort of agenda. So those are the three things I would focus on. I think there's a broader range of questions I think that we need to address. But maybe can I just finish on this, John? I think more generally, we need to do more to embed just transition principles and practices in our movement, in our trade union movement and beyond. So I think we're yet to really fully embrace a green bargaining agenda, which is commonplace across Europe. There's no real discussion of where our pension funds are invested or of the financial system more broadly. And we're good on the public side of the investment equation, but not so good on addressing private finance. We need to have more challenging and open conversations with our members about what a just transition entails, both in terms of the potential disruption and the possibilities it offers. And going back to the Lucas plan, going back to what Hilary and Brenda have talked about, I think union officialdom are often more afraid of these conversations than workers and trade union members. I think they're up for the discussions, and they're up for bringing forth their knowledge and capacities to bear on it. And I think Brenda said this as well, we need to find ways of making better use of the research and the ideas that we have at our disposal, both in academia and in institutions like NERI, to shape our policies and economic strategies, but also to help popularize our vision, help spell out to workers and inform those conversations with workers about what a just transition entails. I mean, Paul and others, including Sean McCabe at Task, yourself, John, we know lots of people are doing really good research around these agendas, but often they don't leave the ivory towers of academia, or they don't percolate down to workers and communities. So I think we need to. It does a real disservice to the research itself whenever we don't make better use of it and try to popularize those ideas, and as part of that, making a just transition a core part of trade union education and organising. So I think I'll finish on those broad points. Thanks, Joe.
Great. Thank you, Sean. Certainly for me, in terms of summarising what you've said, it's a challenge, and I know it's one that's been taken up in other panels on this conference about the public role and usefulness of ourselves as academics in terms of how are we making best use of the knowledge, whether it's social or technological, in terms of the planetary crisis. But for me, I could summarize what you've said, Sean, in terms of the importance of 3 C's of contextualizing the just transition of trade union. Issues are class, capitalism, and decolonialism. So I do appreciate your anti-imperialist and the need to, solidarity across global supply chains. If you don't mind, colleagues, what I'm going to do is pick up on some of the questions coming in from the chat and direct it to particular people. And the first question, I think I'd be particularly interested in the responses from Hilary and Paul. And it has to do with something that Sean has raised, that the just transition concept has at its heart this idea of social dialogue, which can often go down a rather corporatist, reformist approach. And this is related to a question that has come in from somebody about the modern trade union movement is very different now than it was from the 1970s and 80s. And now it's got an emphasis on service provision rather than actually organizing workers and labor. And this service-based view of trade unions is often threatened by ideas emerging from the membership, such as the just transition. And indeed, Sean has already mentioned this. So I don't know whether, Hilary, you have any comment on the trade union now is it fit for purpose? Or is there a prior piece of work to be done in reforming the trade union movement to make it then, more accommodating for just transition ideas?
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. So, yeah, I agree with a lot of what Sean said in sort of critically about the state of the unions. However, I think that, well, I mean, I'm talking only from a limited amount of experience recently. So I think that there's a difference between, in a way, the consciousness and the priorities of workers organized at a shop floor level, and much of the trade union leadership. So in my experience, say with workers at Rolls-Royce or with workers at Airbus, I felt that they both had a consciousness that was both sensitive to the wider social needs, in this context, particularly in the Airbus case, of the pressures and health imperatives of the pandemic, as opposed to the profit imperatives of the corporations and of capitalism, taking one of the C's. So they had a wider, if you like, class consciousness, in that societal sense of class, across the class. And similarly, in the case of Rolls-Royce, a consciousness of their position as workers and producers for society, rather than just for meeting the needs of Rolls-Royce profit sort of imperatives. And also that in both cases, they had the self-confidence to get organized themselves to pursue those broader socially useful goals. And then to draw in the trade union bureaucracy, if you like, trade union leadership. So I think there is that impetus at the base. I mean, I think the same was true of Lucas Aerospace, that actually the Lucas workers, the Combine Committee, was more class conscious, if you like, and thoroughly aware that management were defending their managerial prerogative. They understood the power structure in the way that Sean, I think it was Sean or maybe it was Brenda, talked about, that sort of hierarchy, that sense of management power they were up against. So I think the trade union movement, we need a trade union movement that is more responsive to the capacities, and the more respectful and more responsive, and sees itself as a servant of the capacities and perspectives of the shop floor. So there is a need for democratization, but I think there's an awareness of it. I mean, I've been following the Unite debate, leadership debate, and both the candidates of the left, Sharon Graham and Steve Turner, are both stressing democratization in different ways. I mean, personally, I'm supporting Steve Turner, but I think that Sharon Graham is also stressing the importance of democratization, and so hopefully that leadership will be responsive to this kind of initiative, whoever wins. So I think there is a problem, but there is also a dynamic and a vested interest in change coming from below. And I agree very much with Sean about the expansion of the public sector. And there, I think we have the support of particularly the PCS union and parts of Unison, not so much the leadership, but sections of Unison. And so, in a way, we need a kind of cross-union alliance for socially useful production and democratic public ownership.
That's great. Thank you, Hilary. We have some really excellent questions here, and apologies in advance for not being able to get to them all. We have a really interesting one in relation to, obviously, this is a degrowth and International Society of Ecological Economics conference, and we have somebody asking the question, amongst degrowth communities, the questions of technology and innovation usually draw inspiration from convivial, small-scale and decentralized technologies, which today are promoted in networks of maker spaces, social entrepreneurs and grassroots initiatives. which tend not to be organised through labour and the trade union or organised labour trade unions. What's the view of the panel? And I'm going to perhaps come to Paul here. Should these currently non-unionised innovation spaces and initiatives, should they be incorporated or in some way managed, or should they be left alone? So I don't know whether Paul, you have any comments on that issue.
That's an interesting one. I guess my initial thing, in any case, we should be involved in talking to those centres. The other thing, on occasion, sometimes the sort of decentralised thing. I mean, if you look at like kind of different potential technologies, there is the kind of question that these new kind of new spaces aren't places that are very friendly to organised labour, or there could be, you know, the risk that some of the workers involved within them. Now that's assuming that it's not managed by the workers themselves, and that obviously be a different kind of scenario. But it might not be guaranteed that these kind of new areas are as sort of kind of socially minded as we might like them. And in any case, at the very least, we shouldn't be at cross purposes, and we shouldn't sort of, I suppose, stick to a bias towards the old sectors purely on the basis that, well, we've organised there, so we need to hold on, you know, to this sort of industry for dear life, you know.
That's great. Thank you, Paul. And I think, Brenda, I'd like to bring you in now. There's one question here that I think you might be particularly well placed to answer. And the question is, how can we imagine the future of work in the context of growing outsourcing and automation that result in the weakening of trade unions and the extinction of many occupations? So, Brenda, if you have any response to that.
Yeah, you mentioned there outsourcing of work, and I suppose what is the view of the future of work? Is it, John, that you're kind of
interested? Automation perhaps in particular, given your own interest in AI.
Yeah. I think certainly, moving forward, AI and the development in AI, and before that automation, is sometimes like it's like a runaway train with the ethics carriage decoupled, and I think we have to be very conscious of where automation and AI is taking us, and in that regard, I think that developments of AI and automation into the future need to be grounded, because we can create something or be very innovative. We have to ask ourselves, is that the right thing to do? So I think ethics is very important in this regard. And I think Michael Cooley's human-centered systems approach keeps grounding us in ethics, in asking ourselves, questioning ourselves, is this the right route to go in? As I've said, the development will just keep going and going and going, but is it the right direction to go in? And this human-centered approach, where you have the human-machine symbiosis, where the machine or the AI acts together with the human to do the work, is a far better way forward than removing the human completely from the loop. I think we've tried that with automated companies that are completely automated, and the things that Michael Cooley would say that we should, I suppose, revere are like creativity, innovation, imagination, all that kind of thing. These are things that can't be programmed, and so if you have all those things and you have AI assisting, well, then it's a good, it's a very beneficial package, so to speak,
Absolutely. Now, I couldn't agree more. Perhaps one way of summarizing that, Brenda, is, technology should be on tap but not on top. It should be there to help and aid as opposed to dominate. A really pertinent question, given the interest of many of us at this conference in degrowth, post-growth, or A-growth. Is this question somebody's brought in? How do trade unions feel about deprioritizing economic growth? And what about panelists' views of the views of, or your perceptions of the views or experience of trade unions in terms of, a trade-off between ecological objectives of sustainability and a climate stable, future, and economic or orthodox economic objectives? I'd like to ask each panelist in turn, but I'll turn to you first, Sean, then perhaps Hilary, Paul, and then Brenda. So Sean, what about this idea of, what's your view of a post-growth trade union movement?
Yeah, I mean, as I've said, I think, there are signs of trade unions, certainly in Ireland, moving slowly in the right direction. But that issue of growth and jobs is still very much at the forefront, and that's understandable. But it just shows the importance of the trade unions opening up to these more challenging and difficult conversations, creating the structures where you can involve members in those conversations and thrash out some of those conflicts and tensions that exist in terms of that shift towards a low carbon society. But I think progress has been slow, but it's something that needs to be taken up.
Now, it does seem to me, just before I let you in, Hilary, that neoliberal capitalism is very good at producing jobless growth in terms of GDP figures, and something that myself and Dan Bailey, who's also on the call here, have worked on. But Hilary, what's this? What do you think of this idea of the challenge for orthodox economic growth, and that objective as part of the problem for the trade union movement, that they need to move beyond this fixation on economic growth?
Well, I mean, I think firstly, the sort of reality of non-economic growth, as you're implying, is, it's finance driven. It's not really anymore about the real economy. So there, in a way, we've moved the terrain, and the sort of nature of capitalism has moved on in a way which, in a certain sense, although its brutality is greater, its sort of legitimacy is weakening, because in the past, economic growth meant not always, but it tended to be, as it were, correlated with the growth of jobs in the real economy. That actual public spend, the Keynesian idea that public spending had a sort of what he called a multiplier effect on the creation of jobs. Whereas now, investment is in money. So it's like using money to make more money without the actual, real economy in between. So it's to do with playing the money markets, financial speculation. I mean, that's what's grown. And in our sort of conventional measures of GDP, actually invented by Keynes, ironically, financial growth counts as growth. So anyway, there's a crisis of GDP and measurements of growth. And now inserted in that is a huge public questioning of the nature of our economy. So I think we've got to bring into this the impact of movements that are, in a way, independent of the trade union movement, but to which the trade union movement needs to make, supportive, not gestures, but build relationships. And that's the incredible movement of young people inspired by Greta Thunberg, the impact of Extinction Rebellion. In a way, the sort of whole way in which a new generation, just as my generation was radicalized by 68 and the Vietnam War, and so on, this new generation is radicalized by climate change. in a most urgent and sort of radical way. And I think that impacts on the trade union movement, who, after all, are full of not just producers, but parents, fathers, mothers, you know, who see their lives as partly preparing a better world for their children. And the children are already saying, describing the better world they want.
Great, Hilary. I don't know, Paul, given your own connections with the trade union movement, certainly in Ireland, what's your take, and also as an economist, in terms of a political economist, give you a correct title. You're not naive enough to think that somehow the economy is a politics-free or power-free zone. But what about this issue of a post-growth agenda for the trade union movement?
Very interesting, and thank you for not for crediting me as a political economist. Yeah, to be honest, I mean, to be speaking for myself, that's where something risky might be said, but I think that there is a major issue in that sense. I think a lot of, I mean, it even kind of relates to the social dialogue point, I guess. My sense would be, in many cases in Ireland, the trade unions have been fighting something of a defensive battle. So just getting yourself into a position where we're at the table is sort of a major kind of goal, framing a lot of things. But of course, we're going to need to do more than that. There's kind of pressing, I mean, if in the policy space in Ireland, there's even on its own terms, before we think about ecological crisis, the music's going to stop pretty soon on Ireland's economic model. Our current economic model, based on being maximally kind of attractive to multinationals and basically being the bagmen for international capital as they try and ferry it away, including from the global south. Even the bigger states, the bigger imperial states, they're increasingly becoming less tolerant of our role in that system, and that will kind of, I think, the degree to which that's actually being kind of reflected in kind of policy understandings, it's only starting to kind of dawn on us that, in any case, even if we wanted to keep the model as is, that's going to be ended. Even as I say before, we talk about ecology, but yeah, I think there's a difficulty in terms of imagining what that would mean for public policy of going to degrowth. That's something, it's so kind of deeply entrenched in the way we relate to the system that it sort of constrains our imaginary here. So yeah, as has been said kind of by the other speakers, I think that the fact that the kind of system as is and people locked in and constrained by the system, it's so hard to kind of think outside that, just sort of highlights the need for, at the grassroots, building that organization to really shake it up and to build those capacities so that it feeds up into the movement. But I think, as Sean said, I think there's a bit of a realization there, but I think it's only germinal at this point.
If I could summarize it like this, we need both to decarbonize and to decolonize both the structure of the global economy and to decolonize our imaginary. So let's begin to wind up, folks. I want to bring in my colleague, Dan Bailey, I think, who has a question which summarizes some of the discussion we've had in the chat. But I think it's something that is useful for all our panelists to consider. So over to you, Dan.
Yeah, thanks very much, John. Actually, just before I ask that question, I wonder if I could pick up Hilary on something that she just said. She just seemed to, I think, infer that a degrowth transition involves suppressing some of the aspects of financialized growth, some of the speculative activity in places like Dublin and Canary Wharf and Wall Street. And of course, that sort of growth isn't popular at all, and I wouldn't object to that. But of course, that leaves untouched some of the other aspects, the other components of the economy, which provide quite a lot of jobs, absolutely, but are also far more responsible for some of the greenhouse gases and deforestation. So I wonder if suppressing financialized growth actually isn't going to lead to the sorts of environmental benefits which we hope it will. But the question I wanted to ask to everybody else more broadly, and I guess particularly Sean as well, was about this idea about a just transition being shaped by internationalism and anti-imperialism. I wondered if a just transition which is shaped by those principles includes a Green New Deal, because there are a lot of criticisms that a Green New Deal would simply be a form of green neo-colonialism. It would be a strategy of green extractivism in the global south. So Sean and indeed everybody else, I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and look, I think precisely that's precisely the challenge around the Green New Deal. There is certainly how it's conceived in Europe, that it will become a green form of capitalist colonialism, pure extraction to an exploitative extraction to support our transition to renewables and to a low carbon economy. And I think, unfortunately, that that is the understanding of large sections of the left and the trade union movement of what a Green New Deal will entail. It's a just transition, a Green New Deal for us, and it's continued extraction, expropriation, and conflict for the global south. And that's something that needs to be challenged domestically and internationally. And that entails challenging the current trajectory of the European Union, unfortunately. The European Green New Deal has very little that would make it worthy of the name, and has very few components that would deliver a just transition, not just in Europe, but in the parts of the world upon which this Green New Deal or the Green Deal will depend. So that is a big challenge. It's precisely one of the challenges that I think we need to confront, because that danger is there.
Not as great a challenge as we have in the last 4 minutes to try and bring in everybody else. But if I could quickly go to the other speakers, so perhaps Brenda, then Hilary, then Paul, for a quick reaction on the dangers that if we pop the hood on the Green New Deal, what are some of the extractivist neo-colonial dynamics there that we need to be aware of? So I don't know, Brenda, you have anything to
just thinking about what you're saying there, John, and I'm just thinking about Michael Cooley and how much he was against the scientific one best way. And I'm just thinking as well about the just transition. And I think we have to be careful that we don't make the just transition into a one best way, that it has to be customizable for all cases, on a case by case basis, really. And I suppose going forward, in relation to change is always difficult, and particularly if you're trying to change a power structure that is really coming from an ordered kind of place, like this hierarchical top-down structure. I think that's going to be amazingly difficult. And I suppose in regards to the climate crisis, the thing about that is that we are seeing what happens when we don't make changes, like it's visible, and I suppose I would hope going forward that it wouldn't have to take us going down that road of climate disaster too far before these changes in a just transition will happen in regards to the climate.
It's always easier to fix the roof when it's sunny. Hilary, any quick reactions, and then Paul?
Okay, so building on Brenda's point, emphasis on Mike Cooley's insistence that there isn't only one way, and that includes as far as a Green New Deal is concerned, and applying that to the discussion about resisting colonialism and imperialism. I think that it's really important that our international, firstly, that our just transition is seen as an international movement, an international movement that recognises we're up against an internationally unequal order that's the legacy of imperialism and colonialism, and that in resistance to that, we listen to and build egalitarian alliances with movements in the South, in the colonized or previously colonized and now neo-colonized countries. I mean, like Brazil is a classic, where in the Amazon, where extractivism has been extreme for many years in terms of the forests, in terms of its resources. There are movements, indigenous movements, that have developed their own alternatives that value the understand the earth and the land. And the landless movement is a highly ecologically sensitive movement. I went to some of its schools, and they have a real understanding of the nature of the earth and its potential for people, for social use, if you like, a sort of ecological agriculture. So we're not talking about victims of extractivism. We're talking about people who've resisted extractivism with their own way, their own, if you like, notions of not just transition, but of an alternative. So I think that's the main point I'd make. And so in that sense, many of the philosophical and ethical principles of the Lucas Plan that Mike so well summarized and inspired apply to the way we build an international movement.
Great, thank you. Paul, 30 seconds, any quick comments before we wind up?
Yeah, I suppose just related to the international point, I mean, if anything was going to be international, it'll have to be climate. It just will not happen if we continue to be kind of methodologically nationalist, just saying, what will Ireland do? What will the UK do? But we do have to kind of relate to those other sort of one size fits all. There needs to be sort of some combination of participation on the ground, because they'll be the people who actually know enough to make a plan that will work for an area. But we also have to kind of relate internationally, and I guess that's the open question.
Wonderful, Paul. Thank you all so much. And again, apologies to folks who we didn't get to all your questions. I'd like to thank all our speakers, Brenda O'Neill, Paul Goldrick-Kelly, Sean Byers, Hilary Wainwright, and my colleague Dan Bailey. So have a nice break, enjoy the rest of the conference. Remember to wash your hands, stay socially distanced, and indeed socially distanced from the worst excesses of extractivist, eco-silent neoliberalism. So listen, folks, take care, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.